Okay, folks. Now, I want to talk to you for a few minutes about how the exam is scored. And this is something new that hasn't been discussed much lately because it's only about a year or so since the exam has been modified a little bit. They're doing what they call progressive scoring. They use the term scaling and equating, which is another way of saying that some questions are worth more value to the score that you finally reach than others. The way I like to say it is that they recognize that some of the test questions are more difficult, which is a way of saying you have to look at the issue in the question a little more thoroughly to make sure you understand exactly what's being asked. Now, as an example, I like to say there are easy questions, there are hard questions, there are harder questions, and then there are hardest questions. The hardest questions would obviously have the greater point value, and the easy questions would be worth less to you if they're correct. They also would be less of a negative impact on your score if you miss the easy ones. So let me give you an example. Let's take the term risk to say the working term definition of risk is the chance or uncertainty of an event occurring in the future. So if it's an uncertainty, that word could be associated as a synonym to risk. So a very easy question might drive at the definition of risk, where a more complicated question, a more involved question might talk about why we need to assess risk and understand it for rating purposes and for the acceptability of risks that don't bear too high of a likelihood of occurring. For instance, in Florida, hurricanes and sinkholes have a high risk because of the nature of the geography. Either the aquifer is creating unsafe ground areas in the state, or the storms that come out of East Africa create a problem, uh, or come from the east, I should say, from West Africa, create a storm and risk for the peninsula of Florida. So the more challenging questions are going to be ones where you have to combine or probe more into the issue of the term or the concept being explored in the question. So let's say, why do we need to assess risk? Well, it's going to determine how much the claim would be in some cases, and it's going to determine how likely the loss is in others. So that would be an example of a question that might be worth, say, a little bit more than the value of an easy question because it gets at the heart of why risk is important to the insurance company for an underwriting standpoint. Then you could get into the reason why we might decline someone. If the risk is too high or the loss prospectively is too great, then we might have a situation where we'd have to decline the applicant, and then that person would go on to another risk pool, such as an assigned risk policy. And that would be the location where the risk would be more accurately priced relative to the risk level. So this is a fairly new method of examining the candidate for the license. So you need to be aware that the harder questions are worth more, and they're likely to require you to take more time to scrutinize the question to make sure that you are appropriately thinking about the issue from the right standpoint. And We try to provide you the ability to do this by giving you 4 ways to look at the learning objective in the course outline. Number 1, the working definition is usually a simple detail that you have to know what words accurately define the word or concept. The second is when the question is hard, you might want to know why do we need to calculate level of risk, as an example, so that we can ensure that the losses are not out of line with the premium. In other words, the premiums have to support the losses, and we determine the premium by how much risk we're taking. So we need risk to be quantified and qualified for acceptability to the policy underwriting in order to have the proper number of healthy, reasonable insureds that are appropriate for the risk pool given the premium levels. Then you might go into a more difficult question and say, well, how does it work? Well, we do selection criteria that might eliminate people that are too close to the ocean if it's a hurricane exposure we're concerned about, or perhaps too close to a fault line if it's an earthquake exposure we're worried about. So these are ways to look at the degree of risk we're taking from the standpoint of the amount of the loss or the amount of the risk that we're taking. Risk being the increased predisposition to the claim given the higher level of risk that the insured might have given their circumstance. And the example of that would be, of course, flood insurance. If you're too close to a river, this could be a source of additional risk to the company insuring the client for flood. Then finally, the fourth way that we look at the learning objective, besides the definition, why do we need it, what does it do, allows us to price the policy to the level of risk that we're assuming. And what is the benefit? Again, it protects the level of losses that we're going to suffer based on the fact that we have collected adequate premium to ensure that we're not going to be upside down in a claim scenario given the fact that we didn't collect sufficient premium to underwrite the claims that are likely to happen from that particular coverage. So having presented this in a way that equates more to the scoring model, where they scale the questions to a different value for the question based on the degree of difficulty, you need to be aware that when you're skipping questions on the exam, you're looking for a more thorough probing of the question to make certain that you're addressing either the definitional meaning of the term or concept, or why we need the scrutiny for that particular concept or term. Why is that an important element of the discussion? Then a little bit about how it works. When we underwrite, we look at the exposure that we're going to be dealing with. When it's a certain type of risk, it's going to have characteristics that we're looking at. And then finally, the reason why we need it, again, is to protect the integrity of the risk pool, to make certain that the claims can be paid and that the company's financial standing is protected for all the insureds and for future activities in the insurance industry. Now, what we do in the case of the exam preparation course, we go through each learning objective on the syllabus so that we can address these 4 areas so that you have a connection with how to answer each type of question whether it be simple, definitional, or a little harder where it talks about why we need it, why is it important, how does it work, and what is the benefit accrued from using that management of that particular issue in concert with how we protect the risk pool and protect the insureds from losses that we are not going to be able to pay. So this is why it's important to do more than just a simple review. You have to be probative in your thinking about each one of the things. And what we do in the practice questions is give you the opportunity to connect with all four types of questions when you're doing your practice test to make sure that you are getting a 360 perspective on how to address the exam questions in preparation for your test. The other thing I will mention is don't be surprised if the exam comes at you as a more difficult construction. What I mean by that is you could have a lot of easy questions in a row, and then you could have a lot of hard questions. And sometimes what happens is people get rattled when they get a lot of hard questions. So if you're starting on, let's say, your second test, which is the law test, you might feel pretty good about the general test, but the law test starts out maybe rather difficult. And this could be a moment of panic for you if you decide to kind of let your emotions get away from you. So remember to skip questions when you don't know the question. And that could include an easy question that you're just not recalling the meaning or the working definition of it. Or it could be a hard question, but in either case, you're going to have a better grasp on it once you review it once or twice. In the review cycle, this will allow you to get more answers right. Never answer a question before it's time. The time is when you know the question, understand it, and can select one right answer and three wrong answers. Three wrong answers. Sometimes when you go looking for wrong answers, you discover you've got two right answers, and one's a better choice of the two. So this is important for your selection. Sometimes an answer seems right, but another answer feels right, and the feel right question usually is the better answer when you have struggled with a couple of review cycles to find the right answer. The right answer sometimes is the one that feels right when you're at the back end or the final stages of the exam. So keep your cool. If you start to panic, remember that skip button is your friend. You mark the question for review, you come back to it. It will answer itself some point because you'll feel better about one answer over the other three. Thanks for coming, folks, to look at this video, and we'll give you a chance to practice some of the questions and get a sense of how our questions are matched up with this technique of easy, hard, harder, and hardest, so that hopefully all your easy questions are answered in the first, second round. Your harder questions are answered in the third or fourth round, and you capture the score you need to get your license on the first attempt. Thanks again.